As we conclude our course of study, we'd like you to think about Israel in terms of values nation. In many ways, our whole course has led up to this moment. Can we reframe the way we think about Israel? And in so doing, what is the content that we give? Now, we know how to think about Israel and how to get excited about Israel as startup nation. To be excited about the technological excellence, the innovativeness, the chutzpah, the fact that Israel is achieving levels of excellence in the areas of high tech almost unparalleled in the world. Can we bring that same expectation, that same excitement to the ideals and values of this country? What are these values? How does 3,000 years of Jewish thought, Jewish moral depth, Jewish spiritual excellence enter into our thoughts, not as individuals, but enter into the thinking of the Jewish people in building the Jewish state, in building a sovereign entity, which is not simply a Jewish democratic state, but which embodies the ideology and the category of values nation. And what I would like to share today is what are some of the key ideas that I believe can enrich Jewish sovereignty on the issue of how we look at people and our responsibilities to people, how we look at property and the goods that our societies share, and also how we think about religion in general and God. When it comes to people, our tradition is rich in insights. The first, a source that we've mentioned throughout the year, is the notion that all human beings are created in the image of God. A critical factor of our tradition is that the value of human life, the value that human beings have, doesn't grow out of their religious affiliation, doesn't grow out of their ethnic affiliation, doesn't even grow or enhance necessarily by how smart they are, what they do, how even righteous they are. There is an inalienable value to all human beings, qua human beings. And when we begin to think about our responsibility to people, the first principle that our tradition could teach the modern state of Israel is that when you look at people, when you look at this Jewish state, when you look at the democratic state of the Jewish people, your first fundamental responsibility is to recognize that all human beings, Jews and non-Jews alike, have fundamental value, have inalienable rights, and are equal, both from the perspective of law and from the perspective of value. This notion gets expanded in Leviticus through the concept of love the stranger, for you are strangers in the land of Egypt. But here, if you look carefully in Leviticus, it goes even further. It says, the stranger shall be to you as one of your citizens. This is a key teaching for sovereignty. For one of the great challenges of sovereignty is that you tend to look more carefully and tend to have a greater bond of loyalty and concern for those who belong to your national identity, those who belong to your ethnic community. Well, Israel must be a community with a profound sense of responsibility to its majority, to its community. But it's one which still recognizes that the stranger shall be to you as one of your citizens. There's something more important, more primordial than the national identity, which gives to human life its value. And so as we enter into the national discourse, as we return to sovereignty, it does us well. It bodes us well to remember that sovereignty is a second tier, that nationalism, national identity is a second tier, and that our national identity has to give expression to this profound notion of the value of human life as being primordial because all human beings are created in the image of God. The second feature of how we look at people is that people aren't just simply individuals who inhabit the world with me. They're not just individuals who I somehow in a Hobbesian world have to look at as my competitors. For according to Hobbes, my inalienable right is to do everything that I need to do in order to attain the goods that I require. That in the condition of the jungle, everybody is my competitor. And when I look at people competing with me for the limited resources of the world. And at best, what I have to take upon myself is a responsibility, as Mill speaks about, not to harm them, the no harm principle. I didn't harm you. And in not harming you, I exhaust my responsibility to you. As I pursue the goods that I need, I can't step on you, but my focus still is on me. Here our tradition offers yet a second teaching, and that is the notion that you as a human being can't be somebody who ignores, can't be somebody who remains indifferent. That your responsibility to people is to see them, but to see them and to see your responsibility to be a force for good. Not to remain indifferent. And it doesn't matter whether it is your enemy's ox or whether it is your friend's lost item. When you walk through the public domain, and when you are walking and creating that domain on the basis of Jewish values, the question you have to ask yourself is not whether you are doing harm, whether you are preserving the rights of other people, but whether you are actually a force for good. Whether you see the public sphere as an opportunity for you to express kindness, to express concern, to express interest. The whole Jewish tradition of tzedakah, which sees the act of caring for people as a principle of justice, not as a principle of charity, is grounded on this understanding. When you walk, your question is, I have to see you. Because I recognize that the public domain is one which is inhabited by other people, and the type of Jewish public space is that each one of us has to look at each other and not simply ask, how do we avoid each other? But how do we create a bond? How do we create care? How do we create compassion? How do we create loyalty? When it comes to people, then, the core lesson of our tradition is, number one, the value of people transcends sovereignty. And the second is that the notion of a sovereign public space is a place of compassion, concern, a place where I see you. And in seeing you, that engenders from me profound responsibilities. In the area of property, our tradition as well has a fascinating insight. Whether that property is portable property or whether that property is land, fixed property. As Leviticus teaches us, the most that you can own, the highest level of ownership that you can reach is ki gerim v'toshavim atem imadi. For you are but strangers in my land, God says, with me. If sovereignty could sometimes be confused as creating that space which belongs to this nation, sovereignty gives you your space. In a Jewish sense, that's correct. It's the space where you get to give expression to your national identity. But it's not the place where you become the master. You can never be the master. There's something humbling, and one of the principal roles that God plays in our tradition as the great humbler, that which creates humility. You think it's about mine, you think it's about yours, you think about not in my backyard, you think about the good fences that will create good neighbors, you think about how is it that in the context of society I can make sure that the society protects what is my inalienable right? In one sense that's true. But our tradition says to you that when you think about property, you can never have a capital M. God owns the word capital. God is the only one whose name is capitalized. You can have a small mind. Your ownership is always contingent. Now, this is not a theoretical concept. This is not, okay, you own it, but you don't really own it, it's God's. When God is the owner, it makes you think differently about the value that you place to what is yours. It allows you to share it. It allows you to recognize that you have to give what is yours in order to ensure that all members of your society have a fair share. It makes you look at the world not simply through your own self-interest. It makes you recognize that you're one small part of a larger puzzle, that you never have aspirations to define the whole picture. It allows you to contract yourself. One of the fascinating innovations of Lurianic Kabbalah is the notion that God, in order to create the world, contracts God's self. Because if God didn't contract God's self, there would be no place for the world, because God is supposed to be the infinite. God's supposed to take up all the space. What Lurianic Kabbalah says that the act of creation is an act of contracting. This notion of property being with a small mind is the act of not allowing your personal possessions to take hold of all your consciousness, and to recognize that it must only be one small part of your agenda. Contract your self-interest. Contract the vision of yourself, and in that act of contracting, the other person becomes seen, and the other person's needs become your needs. This notion of not owning as the ultimate end, what's yours is not the most significant, also leads us in our tradition to a different theory about resolution of conflict. In the famous Mishnah that we studied, two people come. Each one is holding on to a garment. Each one is holding on to something. This one says, it's all mine. And this one says, no, it's all mine. This one says, no, I found it. And he says, no, I found it. Now, what are we going to do? When I was young, I thought this text, when I first learned this in elementary school, I thought this was actually a text about a garment. It's not a text about a garment. It's a text about sovereignty. It's a text about the social condition in the public sphere. The reality of social life is that everything that I ascribe ownership to, somebody else will also see as theirs. If both of us come with it's all mine, then the only resolution is perpetual war. And that's, in fact, as you saw what the Tosefta says. Each one gets whatever they're holding on to. Grab it, fight. Before you get to court, who's stronger? If I'm holding it, then it's mine. The rabbis, however, come up with a completely different answer. For the rabbis, the question is not who is the just owner. For them, the fundamental question is how do we enable social life to continue? And they say two people who will come and say, it's mine, and the other one says it's mine. The rabbis say it's very simple. The answer is divided. Of course, maybe one found it first, but so what? So you'll be victorious and social life will be decimated? When life is a capital mine, then the social structure is secondary. In our tradition, our ability to live with each other, our ability to live with coexistence and peace with each other, is more significant than that which is mine. This issue, by the way, is not just about property. And it's not just about conflict with your neighbors within your society. It also is an interesting and important lesson about the way we Jews and our sovereign expression in the Middle East can coexist with other sovereign expressions. We as Jews have not returned to the Middle East to ignore other people's national aspirations. We don't look at the world only through the prism of what our self-interest is. We recognize that at most, we're strangers and inhabitants in God's world, just as you are. That requires of us to contract. That requires of us a little more humility. And therefore enables us to recognize that we have to divide it. And dividing is not a compromise. Dividing creates the opportunity for justice and peace to coexist. And in so doing, sets forth an ideal paradigm of justice and social interaction. The third big idea, the third feature and value of our tradition, which could enrich a Jewish social sovereign experience, pertains to the issue of religion. How do we think about religion? How do we think about God? One of the great challenges facing the integration of religion into a social context is that the nature of a social context is that it belongs to all the inhabitants of that society. A community, a society, is the society of its inhabitants. And we don't agree religiously. No two human beings have the same notion of what it means to be a pious individual, to be a virtuous individual. Human beings don't agree on how we're supposed to worship God. We don't agree on whom God loves more and whom God loves less. Religion is a profound source of disunity amongst people. And consequently, very often, the way in which we attempt to create that sense of peace within society is to create a separation of church from state, or a separation of religion from the public domain. Religion is what you do in your private sphere, because we know that when you try to bring it into the public domain, you're going to become a dictator to your religious truth. You're going to become a dictator carrying your religious truth precisely because you believe that's what you ought to do. You are jealous for your God. And you want everybody to live and to believe in your God the way you live and believe. The third area where our tradition and its values can shape the way Jews build a sovereign nation state is in the area of religion. From our inception, we define the state of Israel as a Jewish and democratic state. And in so doing, gave to Judaism an integral place within the constructs of our society. However, in doing so, by placing religion within a social construct, we are creating a profound challenge. One of the problems of religion within the context of a social reality is that a social reality belongs to the diverse citizens who are its members. And a society is responsible to all of its members. Now, members don't agree on issues of religion. In a synagogue, it's easy. A synagogue, you join when you believe. But I belong, I'm a citizen of this society. When you add religion to that context, invariably what you add is a notion of coercion. Consequently, very often, people prefer to separate the religion from the state. For only when religion is separated from the state is there not going to be the type of totalitarianism which is affiliated and associated with religious belief. When I believe, I want my beliefs to be the beliefs of the public sphere. I want other people to do what I'm doing. Not necessarily because I want to control, and this is one of the difficulties of religion. Very often I want it precisely in order to help them, in order to help my society. If I believe something, if I know it to be true, if I believe that a certain conduct will bring God's blessing and grace upon us, then I want that to be the inheritance of everybody. And consequently, when I integrate it into society, I want my beliefs and my religion to dominate. However, I'm not the only one who inhabits that society. How do I share, from a religious context, a society? How do I create a society which allows for religious difference? Here our tradition also introduces a fascinating notion. Our rabbis teach us in one of the most well-known and most quoted texts. For 3 years, the students of Hillel and the students of Shammai argued with each other. This one said, the law follows me, and this one said, the law follows me. This actually echoes the tractate of Baba Metzia, in which each one says, it's all mine. The law follows me means I know what God wants. I know what religion obligates. But our tradition says, these and these are the words of the living God. When it comes to religion, Our tradition is founded on the notion that no single human interpretation, no single idea could exhaust God. This is the deepest meaning of monotheism. Monotheism is not one God with one truth, which must be forced upon everybody in order to enable them to be saved. Monotheism is the humility of recognizing that you can never exhaust God, and that other people and other interpretations can be equally valid as yours. Religion can enter into the public domain only to the extent that we recognize that no single idea can exhaust truth and can exhaust authenticity. When a single idea exhausts these notions, then we have a dictatorship. But when by definition we know that you only have a partial truth within that religion, then religion could enter into the public sphere and allow other religions to coexist with it, other interpretations. And here too our tradition is clear. It's not just simply Jewish interpretations. It's not simply these and these are the words of the living God. Our tradition recognizes that there are multiple ways to be a lover of God even outside of our tradition. God is not exhausted by the Jews. God could be worshipped equally by non-Jews. The tribe of Levites, who are the paradigm of God's chosen, anointed ones to serve in the temple, what does Maimonides say? Maimonides says not just the tribe of Levites alone, but Kol Ba'ei Olam, any inhabitant of the world, could be like the tribe of Levites. A sovereign state that recognizes that the value of people is not defined solely by membership in your community, who creates a sovereign reality recognizing that human beings have inalienable rights prior to membership, and that while membership generates loyalty, generates responsibility, you have a responsibility which precedes that sovereignty, will not enable your sovereign reality to become an idolatry. A sovereign reality which recognizes that the notion of the public sphere is a sphere where we see each other. A sphere where I do not simply avoid harming you, but I recognize my responsibility to be a force for good, to help you, whether I like you personally or not. And that the notion of a public sphere is a safe sphere where we know we look out for each other. A sovereignty which teaches the notion of property, in which it's never the end and be all, in which you contract your ownership and you recognize that peace and coexistence are more important than mine. Whether that peace is with your neighbor inside your society, whether that peace is in this larger neighborhood, in this world within which we live. A sovereignty which is committed to bring Jewish values into the public domain. Because Israel is the democratic state of the Jewish people, and the Jewish people come with our culture, our language, our values, our traditions. And we don't want to create a public domain which is value neutral. We want to create a public domain in which the rhythms, the songs, the ideas of our tradition could infuse and bring alive the public sphere. That could only be a blessing if we remember that these and these are the words of the living God. Bring your religion. Bring your truth. Bring your faith. Bring your Jewishness. But know that you don't exhaust Judaism. And more than that, you don't even exhaust God. People outside of our faith community could achieve the highest level of excellence, the highest level of sanctity and holiness in the eyes of God. Allows you to bring tradition and your religion into a public domain and allows you to share it. It creates a place in which you're committed that your public domain be filled with your ideas, be enriched with your values, but in which you allow at the same time these values to be defined by other people as well. It is this type of sovereignty that Israel can ascribe to and that Israel can aspire to. We've returned to build a Jewish state. We've returned to build a Jewish democratic state. We have great ideas and great values, which we've inherited over 3,000 years, which can serve as a profound inspiration for moving Judaism, for moving Jewish sovereignty, for moving our return to statehood to deeper and more profound heights of moral and spiritual excellence. Values nation as a defining feature of Israel challenges us to think about what is the Israel that we want, to go beyond the Israel that it is, and to ask what are the core ideas, central principles, important values which we've learnt and which define our tradition, which have to be a part of this sovereign experiment, this sovereign enterprise called Israel. What do you believe are the core ideas, or what is a core value that you believe ought to be the identifier of this modern Israeli society?
Well, one of them, I think, has to be this notion of responsibility. In the Jewish tradition, we have this wonderful concept that we are partners with God in the world that we have. It's on our shoulders too, the kind of world we have around us. And that means we don't get to turn away and say it's somebody else's problem. And not just our tradition, I think our experience as a people is one that knows what a crime indifference is. Perhaps even the greatest crime, in a way. And for us to build a society here in which indifference is not an option, in which if you see a problem, you're there to try to give what you can to solve it. I want us to be known as that kind of people, not just in Israel, but also around the world.
You're asking, it's a switch, because we've been concentrating so much, we're exhausted by our own problems.
Yeah, and you know, I think perhaps that's one of the sources of a certain weakness, I think. Because when you look out and see where else there is a need, where else there is a problem, I think you find new energy to deal with your own problems as well. It's an empowering thing to take responsibility. It's not just a burdening thing, because it means you are a player on the stage. And in a way, that's what sovereignty has given us. Not just the right to be at the table, but the capacity to use that voice to spread our values and to be meaningful players on the world stage.
One of the core values of Judaism is the ideas that the prophets brought us. If we could reclaim being a prophetic people, then I think we could build a society which would be even greater and would model for the world what it means to be like the prophets. Who were the prophets? They were profound social critics. They were religious and social critics of the society in which they lived. And when they were able to critique how people were behaving economically, socially, ritually, then they were able to correct and help the people correct for the ways in which they were actually not following their vision. So a prophetic people is a people who's able to critique internally on a very deep level across the board, and therefore lift the life of the people collectively. And it can do that because it also has a prophetic vision about the future, a vision which is always several steps beyond where we are today, several steps beyond in terms of peace, in terms of social values, and in terms of the experience of the most vulnerable in society. So I think we need to reclaim being a prophetic people.
That notion of critic, we've spoken about this throughout this series, is something that the Jewish community is very often frightened of. You're telling us embrace it?
I'm saying embrace it. I'm saying bring it on from within and from without. It can only make us better.
A century ago, the founder of modern Zionism, Theodor Herzl, called Israel an Alt Neuland. And I think that can be our defining idea as a values nation, an old new land, a land rooted in ancient soil with liberal Western ideals that are building and that are creating a modern democracy. And I think this is really our challenge. How do we go beyond that false choice between modernity and tradition that we seem so stuck with in the 21st century, understanding that we really can take from the best of the West and the best of our tradition and teach it not only to ourselves, but to the world?
It's a new take on the Middle East, because the Middle East is often perceived as, the cradle of civilization, the cradle of the religions. It's the place which pulls you back. It's the antithesis of modernity.
Right, it's often seen as the place of the crazies who are stuck in the past. And I think Islam, Catholicism, Protestantism, Judaism needs to learn that we can be rooted in our tradition, that we can learn from our past, but that we also have amazing new ideas, and how lucky we are to be living in a 21st century where we have both these traditions.
That's like a new take on From Zion Shall Torah Come Forth, a Torah of modernity and tradition which combine them, which are integrated in different ways.
And layered and rich and textured and committed both to the past and the future.
For me, the essence of Israel, the meaning of Israel, is embedded in the circumstances of our founding. We went from a death blow to the Jewish people to what is arguably the highest moment of Jewish life in the last 2,000 years. We were able to transform a condition of absolute despair and turn that into a moment that will be celebrated in Jewish life for centuries to come.
So what value do we learn from that?
Hope. The value that you never give up hope. It is embedded in our DNA.
Or ought to be embedded?
Well, we've proven to ourselves that we can do it. And that is the capacity for what one could call Jewish alchemy, the ability to turn despair into hope.
Could you give me a concrete example how this value of hope could shape or ought to shape sovereign Israel?
Think of Israel's politics in our early years. It was a politics of transcendence, of hope, of inspiration. And that is the politics that Israelis today crave. And when we think of what our political system ought to be, I think that what we are really saying is that we need a politics that's worthy of our capacity, our proven capacity, to turn despair into hope.
It's an interesting take on seeing Israel as the embodiment of the Messianic era. Instead of being the final moment, for you the Messianic era is really a state of mind. It's a hope. It's not the end of days, it's a modality of being.
I like that very much. I would say that in a way, what Israel represents is redemption without messianism.
Hope.
Hope.
That's what redemption means. As we bring this series to an end, what are some of your final thoughts about how we build, or the meaning of, this new covenant between Israel and world Jewry?
For me, above all, there's this sense of great privilege to be part of a people that is the custodian of an ancient story. We are one of the very few peoples that has a kind of contiguous memory with our most ancient roots. And we are now trying to write the next chapter of this very long, extraordinary story. And to be part of that process, to deal with the problems that we face, that for me is the stuff of Judaism. The problems that we face, rather than daunting or depressing us, should be energizing us, because that is precisely the challenge or the premise of Judaism, which is that you take your most lofty ideals and you bring it into history, you bring it into reality. That's what we're doing. And the more daunting the challenge, in a sense, the more the potential for the Jewish people and Israel to reveal its latent greatness.
I like that Zen. I'm sick and tired of constantly focusing on Israel as the central headache of the Jewish people, of Israel the furrowed brow and Israel through the headlines. And to me, what excites me about this project, which brings me here week after week, is the opportunity to look at Israel as an opportunity. And when we talk about Israel, we don't mean just Israel right or wrong. We mean Israel right and wrong. And, and understanding that there's really an opportunity here to start a deeper conversation and to move beyond the simplicities and the polarities. And I think that's what we're trying to do. The great progressive philosopher John Dewey said, democracy begins in conversation. That's what really you're talking about, that Israel, Zionism, Judaism, and the modern life begins in conversation. A conversation that's deep and that's rich, but it's also inspiring.
The most powerful aspect, I think, of this whole project is the idea of covenant. Covenant is the idea that regardless of how far we might feel alienated from each other or how much we might go astray in different times, that when we maintain faith and have a covenantal relationship, that we don't give up. And I see that as a very, very central aspect of what we're speaking about, that this relationship is a covenantal one, that even when we may enormously disagree, even when we have a complete disconnect, there's something of that remnant covenant of the past and its possibilities for the future that we maintain, so we never give up. That's the power of covenant.
And it's not conditional.
It's not
deep and rooted. I like
conditional.
that.
It's deep in who we are as individuals, as Jews, connected to this idea and connected to the future. Sometimes I actually think both Israelis and people in the rest of the world can give up on each other because they feel so alienated and so distant from the projects that are happening here in Israel and from their complexities and sometimes from the stumbling blocks at hand. But I think a covenantal relationship would mean even so, and that's what the Bible has taught us in so many cases, even so, we actually maintain that covenant. We transcend those stumbling blocks and we're able to move forward to the future together.
I think a country that is built on a profound idea is only as strong as its next great aspiration. And it's true of a people as well. A people who are 3,500 years old are only as strong as their next project, as their next move. We have slipped into this mode of protecting what we have. And by doing that, we are, I think, endangering what we have. Our challenge is to imagine and dream what we could be now. It's time for that forward move.
You want the ancient people to stop looking so much to its past?
What I think is that a people who are charged to be a kingdom of priests and a holy nation, who have then been put in the Holy Land, cannot aspire to be normal. That cannot be our objective. And it cannot aim solely to protect what it is, the amazing miracle that we have achieved. We need a forward move. We need to look up and think, what is the next horizon? And that's a project that I think the Jewish people around the world can connect to. To turn the volume down a little bit about defending what Israel is doing now, arguing about it, and lift your head up to the horizon and imagine, what can we be? What does our tradition, our values, our experience inform us, inspire us to imagine is the next great move?
So what does Israel have to do?
We have to open up a new conversation. Invite every Jew. We are the homeland of the Jewish people, which means that every single Jew is invited to this table to imagine what the next part of our story is, and not to be satisfied with normalcy or with protecting what we have, but to think what it is that will be the next great moment.
Thank you all very much. As we look back on our journey together throughout this course, let's recap where we've been. We started with an analysis of the current reality of Jewish life. The reality which is defining and in many ways redefining the relationship between Israel and world Jewry. And the need to move from a solely crisis-based relationship to a covenantal one and to build a new narrative. From there, we looked into the notion of peoplehood. For Israel is only something that we take seriously to the extent that peoplehood is something that we care about. From peoplehood, we move to sovereignty. For not every people has a sovereign expression. While it's your right, Israel is the decision of the Jewish people not merely to be a people, which we could be in the diaspora and around the world, but is to create a sovereign reality. And what is the meaning of sovereignty? And what are some of the benefits that sovereignty can have to Jewish life? From peoplehood and sovereignty, we went to what are the great challenges of sovereignty. And we divided them into two: the challenge of power and the challenge of Jewish democratic state. In the challenge of power, we looked at what is a Jewish narrative of power. How do we relate to power? We haven't used it in a long time. And we don't even have necessarily a way to think about power. And Israel and sovereignty is about power. After the narrative of power, we looked at the issues of just war and occupation, which in many ways are the particular cases of our use of power. And how does a Jewish state fight a just war justly? And how does a Jewish state think about the reality of occupation, which Israel finds itself enmeshed in today? From power, we moved to the challenges of a Jewish democratic state. And we looked at two different issues. The first was, to what extent is a Jewish and democratic state a conceptual oxymoron? We recognize that Israel, as a Jewish nation state, is going to do democracy very, very differently than the United States. Does that undermine the democratic reality or aspirations of Israel? Or is Israel, similar to the European models, a democratic state of a different form? And what does the Jewishness of a Jewish state require? What does it mean? And how do we make sure that the Jewishness of the state of Israel is defined in such a way that Israel is only as Jewish as democracy allows and not as democratic as Judaism allows? The second dimension of the Jewish democratic challenge was looking at the particular issues of religious pluralism and the rights of minorities in the state of Israel. How do we have to think about these questions? How do we have to rethink our policies on these questions? And finally, we turn to Israel as values nation. We know that sovereignty has profound challenges. And we know that Israel, which we've created, is not necessarily an Israel which embodies everything that we yearn for. But at the same time, sovereignty is not just a challenge. Sovereignty is an opportunity to bring our ideals and values into the public domain and to create something of excellence. What are those ideals? What are those values? What is going to be the Jewish values content of our narrative? That's the journey. We've embarked on this journey for one reason. Because we believe that one of the unique opportunities of contemporary life is to create a new and vibrant Judaism in which Jews of the world and the Jews of Israel are partners with each other. We don't want a Judaism in which we feel united to each other because somebody is trying to kill us. We don't want a Judaism in which we feel profound loyalty, care, and compassion because we have an outside enemy. I don't want to be a part of a Jewish people which needs an Ahmadinejad to create vibrancy and vitality. We embarked on this project because we want the Jewish people to be one, not simply because we've had a great past, but because there's something new that we can learn from each other. There's something great that we can do to create a new future. There are two vibrant Jewish communities, powerful, one in Israel in the midst of sovereignty, and one outside of Israel, in the midst of a minority reality. Each is producing a new Torah. Each is producing great ideas which could enrich each other. Imagine a Jewish people which takes this opportunity, takes this unique moment in Jewish life, and goes to a new height. Imagine a Jewish people which is not frightened of expectation, which is not frightened of leaving alone and leaving aside the crisis-centered consciousness. Imagine a Jewish people which works very, very hard to ensure that Jews are safe and is aware of the fact that the world is not always a safe and welcoming place for Jews. But it is a Jewish people who, despite that, and in many ways precisely because of that, reaches higher. A Jewish people which expands, grows, deepens, thickens, and makes more meaningful what it means to be a Jew in the modern world. We can do that if we walk together. We want Israel and world Jewry to engage each other in a new conversation, a conversation of respect, a conversation of admiration, a conversation grounded on the simple principle that we have what to give each other and what to learn from each other. And that our loyalty towards each other is not simply and only a loyalty in times of crisis, but it's a loyalty in which each one of us takes the other to ever higher levels of greatness. That's what Jewish history requires of us. That's what Jewish history demands of us at this moment. Thank you for being with me and for being with all of us this year.